Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is the 5th YouTube session of the 7th fall edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. My name is Anusha Kandasivam, and I am your moderator for this session. Through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 12 award-winning and best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking. So I'll be telling you a bit more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser a little bit later. We have lots and lots of exclusive author goodies. But meanwhile, if you want to find out more about the Pixel Project and the work that we do, go visit our website, www.thepixelproject.net. Okay, so we have a very special guest today. We have Sarah Gailey. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you so much for being with us. Sorry if you can hear some background noise. There's some stuff going on outside my house. So Sarah, let's tell you about Sarah. Sarah is an acclaimed science fiction and fantasy author. They have a Hugo Award. They're a Hugo Award winner who lives and works in Los Angeles in California. Their nonfiction has been published by Mashable and the Boston Globe, and their fiction has been published internationally. Their novel Magic for Liars was an LA Times bestseller. So Sarah has very generously donated some awesome goodies for our stash that we have set up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. So two things. The first goodie is the Sarah Gailey first edition book bundle for beginners, which is such an awesome name. It's basically a book bundle of their books and a handwritten note from Sarah. And this one has already been snapped up. So thank you so much, Stephanie Curry, for donating and getting Sarah's book bundle. Yay! The other goodie that Sarah has is the Sarah Gailey Critiques Your Work in Progress. Now, this one is amazing. It's available worldwide. Sarah is offering the chance for one donor to get a written critique from them via email. So this opportunity includes one written critique of 10,000 words from your work in progress. That's a lot of words. And a maximum of 5 emails sent to Sarah with your questions, also a maximum of 5 questions, after they have sent you their critique. So this is a great opportunity to have a really good discussion with an amazing author. So this is still available. Now, we've so far raised $1,090 towards our $5,000 goal. So fundraising is going a little bit slowly, but we have hope. So please do give generously before the fundraiser ends on the 18th of October. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. And we'll be sharing the links of how to get to the Rally Up page. So if you're watching this session on YouTube, you'll be able to ask Sarah your questions as well. Just make sure you're logged onto your YouTube account and you can type your questions into the chat box. And our chat box moderator, Denisha, will relay them to me and I'll read them out to Sarah, who will answer your questions. So, okay, so now I'm going to hand it over to Sarah. We're going to do a reading. So, okay, just put you on screen and go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I am so excited to be working with the Pixel Project to end violence against women. I am going to be reading to you today from the Book of Dragons anthology, in which I have a short story called We Don't Talk About the Dragon. And I won't tell you too much about the story other than to say that it is very much a story about abuse, cycles of abuse, and the way that women from very young ages are taught how to live in those cycles and how to survive them. I don't think there's any content warnings necessary here, but if you're here, then you're hopefully prepared to hear a little bit about the emotional impact of violence against women, and in this case, against children. If you are not prepared for that, you might be in the wrong place, because that's what this is all about. All right. Again, this is from the Book of Dragons anthology, edited by the brilliant Jonathan Strahan, featuring a lot of other wonderful authors. Cecily is 6 years old, and there is a dragon in the barn. Cecily knows what you are thinking. You're thinking that something will have to be done about the dragon. You are thinking that a dragon should not live inside a barn and that the story will be a story about what is to be done about the dragon. But you're wrong. Nothing needs to be done about the dragon because there's no problem with having a dragon in the barn. Cecily knows that this is true, just as she knows that she must never discuss the dragon with anyone in town. She knows it's true because it has always been true. It will always be true. The dragon is not to be discussed. If Cecily brings up the dragon over the dinner table, her mother will reach over and shake her by the back of her collar, and then after the plates are cleared, her father will give her a talking to about her attitude. He will make her feel very aware of the fact that he is big and she is small, and he is strong and she is not. She will go to bed with a knot in her belly, and she will toss and turn all night, and she will wake up afraid. Cecily does not want to wake up afraid, so she doesn't bring up the dragon except in sideways looks she shares with her brothers and her sister. Once she tried to share a sideways look with her mother. That did not go well. Cecily has learned to be careful with her, too. There's a dragon in the barn, and it is just the way things are. Cecily is 8 years old, and there is a dragon in the barn. Going near the barn is hard. The dragon radiates anger, a kind of hot, oppressive anger that looms tall and thumps heavy. Cecily knows this because every time she goes near the barn, she feels hot and sudden fear. The red paint on the outside of the barn is peeling like an all-over scab, and the big barn doors loom too tall for no reason Cecily can see, and the whole thing sits on Cecily's father's land like a stain on a new dress. The grass around the outside of the barn is green, which doesn't make any sense because the barn is so hateful and cruel that everything near it should be blighted. It is Cecily's turn to feed the dragon. She chews on a sourgrass stem and stares at the barn from a distance, holding a bucket of iron shavings that her father brought home from the foundry where he works. He says that he works there because it's the best way to get iron shavings for the dragon, and whenever he says this, Cecily's brothers slide each other those forbidden sideways looks because they know that when they are old enough, they will have to work at the foundry too. They will be the ones coming home at dusk, sweating and scarred, their pockets full of iron scraps to drop into the bucket by the kitchen door. The bucket is thick plastic with a metal handle. The handle has a kitchen rag wrapped around and around it to keep it from digging into Cecily's hand too hard. It's enormously heavy. A month's worth of pocket iron is in there, so the bucket is all the way full, and that means it needs to be emptied. Cecily spits out the chewed-up sourgrass stem. She knows what you were thinking. If she doesn't feed the dragon, then maybe it will go away. After all, it isn't trapped in the barn. It just likes to stay there because there's iron and darkness and owls and other things that dragons like. Maybe, you're thinking, if Cecily stops feeding the dragon, it will go away. But you're wrong. Cecily has to feed the dragon because it's her turn, and because the bucket is all the way full. If she doesn't feed the dragon, then the bucket will overflow. There will be scraps of metal on the floor. Her mother will look at her with grave disappointment, will tell her that she should go to her bedroom until her father gets home, and it won't matter if Cecily tries to spill up the spilled iron, because her mother will have decided that she needs fixing. She'll go to her bedroom and clean it and tidy it, hoping that her cleanliness there will be enough to make up for her other failures. And then her father will come home, and her mother will tell him what she has done, and she will be afraid, and then all of her fears will come to pass. Cecily has to feed the dragon. It's her turn. That's just the way things are. Sometimes there's a dragon in the barn, and it's your turn to feed the dragon. Cecily is 8 years old, and even she understands that this is how the world works. She would explain all this to you, if she had time, but she has to do her chores. Cecily is 10 years old, and there is a dragon in the barn. The ladder to the hayloft has not gotten less scary over the years. It's so high up, and it's not fixed to anything. It just leans up against the outside of the barn, even though Cecily's father keeps saying that you really ought to strap it down with plumber's tape or a cross brace or something. The metal gets wet in the winter and hot in the summer, and no matter what time of year it is, the whole thing wobbles and shakes and creaks in ways that make Cecily feel like there's something yanking at her belly button from the inside. The bucket is still heavy too, and she's starting to wonder if maybe it's getting heavier as she gets older, because surely it should feel easier to carry by now. The dragon is still angry, and his anger still radiates through the wood grain of the barn like heat rising off asphalt. Cecily has almost gotten used to it, although when she's finished feeding the dragon, she always runs away from the barn fast as her legs will carry her. Climbing the ladder one-handed has gotten easier, so at least there's that. Cecily braces the forearm of her bucket-carrying hand against the frame of the ladder to keep her balanced every time she has to take her free hand off the ladder to grab a higher rung. That forearm, her left, is scarred from all the times the ladder's been sun-baked scalding, from all the times she's slipped and caught herself hard on the frame. She has an angry scab on her chin, too, from the time last month when she didn't catch herself. She fell hard that day, bouncing her chin off the rung of the ladder that her foot had been on just a moment before. Her mother scolded her when she came back to the house spitting blood. Her mother told her to take her time, be more careful, not to rush. Then her mother sent her back outside with an ice cube in her cheek to suck on, because there was iron scattered all over the ground at the base of the ladder, and the dragon still needed to be fed. Cecily remembers the way the ice crunched between her back teeth as she picked through the weeds to find all the iron she could. She managed to fill the bucket back up all the way, and then she climbed the ladder again because the dragon needed to be fed. Of course, you are thinking that Cecily could just open the barn doors up and get to the dragon that way. After all, the barn doors are on ground level, and they're well oiled and easy to open. Her father opens them once every 6 months when he goes in to try to talk to the dragon, ask it to leave. Every time he does this, he swears that he's going to make it stick this time, that he's going to look that dragon in the face and tell it to get out of the barn for the good of his family. Every time he tells them that things are really going to change. You are wondering why Cecily doesn't just open the barn doors. Why she carries a heavy bucket of scrap iron up a dangerous ladder. Why her brothers do that when it's their turn to feed the dragon. Why the dragon is there at all. You're wondering why they feed the dragon from the hayloft instead of from the ground. Cecily has asked this question herself, which was tricky, because asking questions about the dragon is not allowed. It's not that she's ever been told it's not allowed, but she knows it's not allowed the way so many things are not allowed, like telling your mother that there's too much pepper on the pork chops, or making a joke about how much her older brother hates working at the foundry. No one says not to do these things. But if she does these things, a weight will descend on the room like a fog, and her father's eyes will go dark and cruel, and everyone will find quiet excuses to leave the room before the weight in the room congeals into a consequence. But the day Cecily fell off the ladder, her tooth fell out at dinner, and her father asked what happened to her with real concern in his voice, and she gathered her courage, and she told him. I fell off the ladder, she said. What were you doing on the ladder? Her father asked, which struck Cecily as strange, because there's only one reason why she would be on the ladder, but then she realized that she was being tested, that there was a right answer and a wrong answer, and she had to think hard before giving her reply. The bucket was full, she said. Her oldest brother exhaled softly beside her. Her mother took a long sip of water. Cecily read these movements as signs that she'd answered her father correctly, because no one was looking at her with warning, and no one was moving toward the door. You'll be more careful next time, her father said, cutting a piece of chicken, but looking at Cecily's chin. That's going to scar, I bet. Shame. Right on your face. And this is the part where Cecily needed an awful lot of courage, because she knew that it was supposed to be the end of the conversation. Her father had told her how not to make the mistake again, and he'd said something very slightly cruel about the consequence of her mistake, something that could pass for an observation, but that would stick with her for a long time. Shame, she would think that night as she tried to fall asleep. Shame. This was the part where one of her brothers was supposed to change the subject, to ask their father for advice about a problem at school or at work. But Cecily swallowed around the nothing that was suddenly taking up her entire throat. She reached under the table and grabbed her middle brother's hands, and he squeezed her fingers, and he gave her the courage she didn't have enough of. Maybe I could go through the door next time instead of using the ladder. She said it in as reasonable a voice as she could. Cecily's mother put her knife and fork down on her plate and glanced toward the kitchen door. I should check on the kettle, she said, which was silly because the kettle wasn't on, but no one would say anything about that because they were trying to figure out their own excuses to leave the room. If one person's excuse was silly, then everyone's excuse might be silly too. You don't need to check the kettle, Cecily's father said. Stay. Let's talk about this idea Cecily has. Oh, that was new. The raw patch on Cecily's chin throbbed. Cecily and her brothers exchanged glances, wondering if this was a trap. Well, I just wondered. You didn't wonder, Cecily's father said, pointing at her with the tip of his knife. You decided that you know best. Cecily's oldest brother stared at his lap. Yes, it was a trap, and it was already too late for any of them to escape. Cecily would have liked to say that she didn't decide anything, that she didn't think she knew best, but that would have been arguing, and arguing is even worse than deciding. A small, quiet part of her whispered that maybe she did know best, and after all, why couldn't her ideas be good? She cupped that small, quiet part of her in her hands, and she crushed it, fast and merciless. I'm sorry, she said, looking at her father's hands, because she was supposed to look at him when she was talking to him, but she wasn't supposed to look willful. Why are you sorry, he said. Oh, that was new, too. She looked up at her brothers for help, but they looked as confused as she felt. Another trap. I'm sorry for saying something stupid, she said. I didn't think... No, her father interrupted. You didn't think. When he said that, Cecily's eyes burned with tears because this, at last, was familiar territory. She knew what to expect. As her father talked about her attitude and her thoughtlessness and everything else that was wrong with her, she swallowed those relieved tears back because they'd only make things worse. She also swallowed back laughter because this, at last, was the easy part. So you may wonder why Cecily climbs the ladder instead of simply opening up the barn door. Cecily would tell you why herself if she knew how to say it. But she is only 10 years old, brave and bony, and trying not to fall off a wet ladder. And it's too hard to explain to a stranger who has never sat at her dinner table. That is from We Don't Talk About the Dragons in the Book of Dragons. You can get this book anywhere books are sold if you want to find out more about what happens to Cecily and the dragon. I will tell you that it is one of the more personal and healing things I've ever written. And it is an incredible company in that book.
It was a very compelling story, and I do want to know what happens to Cecily. I've not read that story. Can I just ask a question that I was, unscheduled question, which is why a dragon?
Honestly, it's because that's what the anthology was. The story was written, as many of my short stories these days are, for kind of an existing collection or an editorial brief. And the brief for this one was write a story with a dragon in it, write a story about dragons. And I'm not a dragon person. There's dragon people. There's people where that's kind of their thing that they're into. Yeah. And kind of like how there's people who are very into mermaids. And dragons are not my thing at all. I'm not highly invested in them or passionate about them. And so I thought, well, what the heck am I going to write about a dragon? I don't think anything about dragons. But I wanted so badly to work with this editor and on this anthology because it seemed like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Okay.
And so I sat down and said, what am I going to write about dragons? And then this story came out of me faster than anything else I've ever written.
I think it's actually a brilliant metaphor, if I can call it that, for the abuse and the emotional abuse, especially. It's that big thing that you can't see and you can't describe, but it's there. It's scary.
I wanted so much to talk about the way that when you are in an abusive situation or dynamic, even if there's violence, even when you're living in fear all the time, you get so acclimated to it that it's just like, this is the rhythm of your life.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, so go and check that story out, everyone. Okay, so let's go straight into our questions. So we have a bunch of questions for you, Sarah, and hopefully the audience members, whoever's watching, please do ask your questions as well. Sarah would love to answer them. So my first question, let's set it up. So your books, you feature many compelling female protagonists. Ivy and Tabitha, Esther, Alexis, Archie, Adelia, I can just go on. They're all complex, they're human characters with agency, whose personalities, attitudes, and understanding of the world evolves as their stories unfold. Could you tell us who or what are your inspirations for your female characters?
Oh my gosh, I mean, just the people who I've known in my life, especially the women and trans and non-binary people who I've known in my life, so have informed the way that I write women and trans and non-binary people. Members of marginalized genders, I think, is like the current umbrella term, which of course not everyone loves. It's hard to find one that feels right for everybody. But, I try to ground my characters as best I can in the reality of complex motivations and complex people who are not in any sense of the word perfect, but who I would never describe as flawed because that boils a person down to their inadequacies or their shortcomings. And that's something that I've learned from the people who I've known and been in relationship with, who have been so kind as to be honest with me and so kind as to let me be a part of their lives.
That's a great answer. Okay, so all genres, including fantasy, have their share of female stereotypes and tropes. So you write what perhaps could be described as speculative fantasy. There are alternative histories or potential futures, which could easily fall back on on much worn tropes. How do you break stereotypes and subvert tropes to create a female character with agency who is dealing with the world around her, including sexism, misogyny, violence against women and girls, especially those who don't fit into culturally prescribed gendered norms, including in appearance and behavior?
I mean, I would say that I do the best I can. I, first of all, struggle a little bit with the idea of tropes because a lot of us in the world of media and entertainment and like just the creative fields have become a little bit trope poisoned. It's very easy to boil anything down into a trope and say, well, that's been done before. That said, I think that tropes are a part of how we interpret the world in many ways and a part of how we as humans categorize and engage with and understand the world around us. And so I'm highly susceptible to using them. So I really, instead of trying to erase them from my work, I try to just be mindful about them. I try to approach my work as honestly as I can and say, okay, I recognize that this is a trope. Am I grounding it? I think that's the moment where people who are consuming media, who are reading or watching a television show or a movie, will say, "Oh no, this is just a trope." Is when the thing that they're seeing isn't grounded in any kind of reality for the character. It's just there reflexively, because the person who created the piece of media that they're consuming is basing that character on other pieces of media instead of on the idea of a real person with real needs and ideas and history.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, so now your books, they pass the Bechdel test, definitely. Not just in the conversations that the women have, but in the multi-layered depiction of relationships between women. One example is the relationship between the sisters, Ivy and Tabitha in Magic for Liars. It's very complex, but you've taken this classic sisters as rivals and polar opposite twins tropes and subverted them. Why did you decide to write a story about female rivalry?
Oh my gosh, I don't think of it that way. Oh, it's so interesting. I guess, I mean, in some ways, everything that I write could be described as female rivalry, right?
Yeah.
Because I so often have female characters who are in conflict with each other. And I find it so interesting to frame that as rivalry because we don't frame everything as rivalry. Rivalry, I think, implies a scarcity mindset that says that there's only so much success to go around.
Yeah, correct.
And I think that when we talk about, especially about female rivalry in professional spaces, we're very much talking about it like you're vying for a limited amount of success that women are allowed to have. I frame it so much more as like the battle for relationship. In Magic for Liars, Ivy and Tabitha love each other and have loved each other and have missed each other and kind of hate each other and don't know how to be around each other. And they're both desperate to have a relationship with each other and both desperate to get away from each other at all times. And I guess that does breed something like a rivalry, especially when you bring Tabitha's brilliance and Ivy's deep sense of inadequacy about that brilliance into the mix. But even then, they're not trying to succeed at the same thing. And that's so central to those characters is that they reject each other's lifestyles in some ways to avoid a sense of rivalry because they both feel like they don't measure up.
Yeah. That's a very good point you make, actually, because, like we're talking about tropes. You put these two sisters, or these two beautiful women, and you expect them to be rivals immediately, especially like over a man or over a career or something like that. But you make a very good point of they're not actually rivals. Their goals are different, but they're just, everybody has these kind of relationships where you love each other and then you don't like each other and then you argue, but then you actually, you can't live without each other. You're right. It's normal because women are human too.
Yeah. Well, and I think that so often women are put into situations, especially again in professional environments, where they're told, okay, you've got to fight your way to the top. And that's just another way of preventing collective success. I mean, it's a very hetero-patriarchal capitalist perspective on what people are capable of. And ultimately, the goal of that kind of point of view and message is to keep people from working together. I mean, if you watch the fundamentally perfect Dolly Parton movie 9 to 5, you see what happens when women decide that they're not rivals and instead they work together toward a goal. and this might be a little very socialist of me, but I think that collective action is much more effective than rivalry and competition.
I agree. Why do you think that many authors still have trouble writing stories that pass the Bechdel test, and despite the fact that there are many more things that women talk about other than men, and women can have a relationship with each other without men?
I think that part of it is fear. I think that there are a lot of writers who are afraid to get it wrong. And I think that part of it is that for so many of us, we think that we know what the world is like because of the media that we consume. I have an example of this that I love talking about because it's very it's like embarrassing for me at a level that I'm okay with sharing with any audience. And it doesn't make me look too ignorant about other people, just about the world in general. So in River of Teeth, which is a pulp western in terms of genre, there's a scene where a bunch of people who are basically cowboys are playing a card game. And in the first draft that I turned into my editor, they were playing a card game that I thought was poker. And my editor returns the manuscript with, a lot of brilliant notes, but one of the notes was, what card game are they playing? And we were on a live chat, and I said, they're playing poker. Why did I not make that clear? And he said, how do you think poker is played? Because it turns out he actually is a poker player. And I said, you get a bunch of guys, and they sit around like a round table. And there's a guy in the middle, and he's got all the cards. And he gives the guys around the table each some cards. And then all the guys around the table, they look at the cards and they go, ooh, bad cards. Or they go, oh, good cards. And then
that sounds right, yeah.
They give some cards back, or they don't, and the guy in the middle gives them some more cards, and then somebody says you cheated, and then everybody stands up and draws their guns, and they have a big fight. And that's how poker is played.
Yes, correct.
Right? Yeah, I thought I was pretty close. Apparently that's not anything. That's not at all how poker is played. And my editor said, why do you think that's how poker is played? And I was like, well, I don't know. I mean, movies. Yeah. And I realized that my whole idea of how the game of poker is played was based on the media I had consumed, where poker was not actually probably happening. 3/4 of that was probably blackjack. I have no idea how to play poker.
Oh.
Not at all. And my editor said, either you have to learn how poker is played and rewrite the scene, or make it a different card game. And I wound up making it a card game that doesn't exist. That basically sounds like what I just described to you. I tell this whole story to demonstrate how we internalize the media that we consume and say, okay, that's probably accurate. And our brains go, great, now I know how the world works. I think that there are a lot of people out there who think that women don't talk to each other, who think that women don't talk to each other about things that aren't men, who think that women don't think about things that aren't men. It's a lot like media where there's a group of friends and there's one gay friend in the group and everyone else is straight. When in reality, queer people find each other. It's not super common to have a queer person who's friends with all heterosexual people and that's their life. It's way more common to find queer people who are friends with each other because there's community, you support each other, and you talk and think about each other and you care for each other. The same is true of women. Women talk about all kinds of things, and sometimes they talk about men, and sometimes they talk about, rocket science. Like, they talk about all kinds of things because they're whole entire people. But I think that if you're writing women based on your experience of women, which might be limited, and your experience of women in media, which is travesty, then you probably think, oh yeah, I know what women are all about. They like talking about boyfriends, I guess.
Yeah, that's a very good explanation, actually. Okay, so what can you suggest for writers who want to write female conversations and relationships realistically?
I mean, I feel like a broken record, but just think of your characters as people. I would approach this the same way that I actually approach anything, because I think that if you're not writing your female characters realistically, you're probably not writing your male characters with much depth either. You're probably not writing any queer, non-binary, or trans people, because you're not thinking of people as people. You're thinking of them as leverage for your plot and for your story. You say, I've got a story that I want to tell about a guy who like breaks into a submarine and, you know, steals it and takes it to the moon. And you think of that guy as someone whose job is to work for you as the author who's writing a plot, and you've hired him to break into this submarine and steal it and take it to the moon. You don't care why he's doing it. You don't care what he wants. You don't care what he's interested in. Right? So if you're going to write that story well, you need to give that character a reason to want to do all these things and internal emotions and motivation. That should be true of all your characters, and that should include your female characters. And your female characters' motivations need to include a view of the self as a person. Women who are written as having a motivation of get a husband, the end, because I want one and that's all I care about, aren't being written as people with a view of the self. There's this concept of negating the self that we talk about a lot in contemporary mental health conversations, where people will erase themselves in an effort to be loved and respected by others. And, you know, when you do that for your characters, you do them a huge disservice. So instead of saying, oh, this character, all she wants is a husband, you got to say, why has this character put this goal above even the concept of their own needs? What would cause that? What would drive that? And that's just, I mean, it's just an issue of craft. I think people get really caught up in this idea that what we're talking about is an issue of like politics or representation. And yeah, those things are important to think about, but also like you're not doing good craft. You're not doing good writing and authorship if you're not doing this work to make your characters wholly realized people. So, you know, think of it as a craft issue and develop your characters more deeply and have that apply across the board, and then you'll write better stuff.
Yeah, okay, that's good advice. Now, some of your female characters that you've written may be perceived by readers as unlikable because they're crooks, they make big mistakes, they betray their friends, or they're just jerks, all around jerks. Yeah, there are people like this. So when you're writing female characters, do you ever feel pressured by gender and cultural stereotypes to make them likable or relatable?
Oh gosh. So
or have you been pressured by like editors or anyone like that?
I'm sure that there have been times when editors have been like, you have to make this character more likable, but it's pretty rare. I'm very fortunate to work with extremely good editors. I definitely feel pressure, though, to make my female characters more likable, because it's this thing where a big part of self-care as an author and as a creative professional is not reading your reviews, which means that, of course, we do it. And it's a very bad idea. It's always a bad idea to read your reviews. But, of course, sometimes it's just like, all right, I'm doing this. And the ones that always trip me up are the ones that say, I found this character completely unlikable. I thought that she was awful. I thought that she was self-absorbed and complained all the time. That's hard because a lot of times the things that people are critiquing are the most personal things that I've put in the book. They're the parts of the character that I've made most like myself, which I don't write self-inserts. I don't write like characters that are supposed to be me. But I do take bits of my brain and my life experience and I put them in my books because I'm not a robot. And it's hard. It's hard to see those things. So I have this temptation to sand my characters smooth so that they'll be more palatable, so that people will say, wow, I just liked this person and wanted to be their friend, because then I'll feel like they're talking about me. But I actually tend to get the opposite feedback of what you asked about from my editors. My editors tend to say, hey, you're holding back. You're trying too hard to make this character likable. You're trying too hard to make this character easy on the reader. You don't need to do that. And then I'll say, are you sure? And they'll say, yeah. And then I'll cut the break lines and write the character how it's supposed to be written. And it always comes out better. It's always more honest. And the thing that really gets me is when I do that, and then I have readers contact me to say, oh, I saw myself in this character. And it's like, oh, that's the real honest reward, is not people saying this character was easy, but people saying, I saw myself in this character and it was nourishing.
That's pretty cool. Do you, okay, so we've spoken to female authors who have talked about getting flack for not making female characters likable enough. As a non-binary author, do you encounter the same kind of pushback?
No, because my non-binary characters are like insufferably perfect. Writing non-binary characters was part of how I realized that I am non-binary, because I started writing non-binary characters, and inexplicably all of them were like really hot and smart and funny and competent, and they were always the love interest. And finally a friend of mine was like, hey, what's up with this? And I was like, I don't know what you mean. Maybe, I don't know. They just did. You think that this non-binary character is really cool? Oh, weird. Interesting. Tell me more about that. So really, the critiques that I should be giving are that my non-binary characters are a little bit too great of people. Like, they should have a little more nuance, but I just can't do it yet. I'm like, no, I still need to make sure that the non-binary character is the one everyone has a crush on.
Yeah, I kind of had a crush on Hero. I was like, why? They're perfect. Anyway, okay, so we have 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Let me just ask one. Here's Misty306, who is a regular viewer. So Misty306 asks, in your opinion, which recent books that you've read contains the best representation of females and LGBTQIA people?
Oh, this is a really interesting one. I always hesitate to talk about whether or not books contain good representation of LGBTQIA plus people, because the queer community is not a monolith. And this is a question I get a lot. So this is I want to emphasize that this is not like that the question is bad. This is like my own hesitation, because I'm like, I don't want to speak for everybody. I don't want to cause harm by like erasing anyone in the queer community. Everyone's experience is different. We're a vibrant, multi-layered community, and so on. That said, I will say that one of my personal favorite experiences of representation of queer people in something that I read was the upcoming Casey McQuiston novel, One Last Stop. Casey McQuiston wrote Red, White, and Royal Blue, which was like the breakaway hit of last summer in, I think it's a new adult romance. It's a brilliant book about the son of the President of the United States, who has this ongoing antagonistic rivalry with one of the young princes of England, and they have this rivalry and they come to blows, and paparazzi catch it, and so their families say, in order to fix this PR problem, you two have to pretend to be friends.
Yeah.
And you have to do it for the media, and so they pretend to be friends for a little while, and then they fall in love. And it's like, it's a beautiful book. It's very sweet. It's very tender. It's very kind to the reader. It was very healing as an American to read a world where America is different from what it is. And the Casey McQuiston's second novel, upcoming, which is called One Last Stop, is the story of a young woman who lives in New York who falls in love with a girl on the train, only to discover that the girl she's in love with on the train might be either a ghost or someone caught in a time loop, and she has to figure out what is going on with this girl on the train who she falls in love with. And it's an incredible book. Of course it is, because Casey McQuiston is like a genius. But it's so beautiful about queer community and what queer community is and what queer people can be to each other and how we fight for each other and take care of each other and protect each other and hurt each other and heal together and love each other. I found it to be, what's the best word for that? It healed parts of me that I didn't know were hurting to read. And I thought it contained beautiful representation of queer community. In terms of best representation of women, I gotta say, everything by Alex Harrow, that's Alex with an I, Harrow. They wrote the 10,000 Doors of January, as well as the Once and Future Witches, which I believe is also an upcoming title. And their writing is so complex about the relationships women have with each other and with the world. It's really beautiful. It's very nuanced. It's very honest. That question that you asked about me writing unlikable women. Alex does incredible work in writing women that I think a lot of short-sighted, ignorant people would call unlikable, because they are honest and raw, and you get a very real sense of their emotions and their background and history. Absolutely brilliant. I cannot recommend their work highly enough. So if you're looking for the answer to this question, the best thing I can point you at is Casey McQuiston and Alex Harrow.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for the recommendations. Okay, let's move on to my next bunch of questions. So we've been talking about women. We've been talking a tiny bit about non-binary people. Let's talk about men.
They love that.
Okay, so your books, they do feature some misogynistic characters, of course. But, there are relationships between main characters that are equitable, and many male characters are respectful of women and other genders and of their thoughts and decisions. In some of your books, the main characters see all genders as equal, and all gender expressions and sexualities are accepted in some of them. So do you think reframing how stories portray men away from the hostile and toxic stereotypes and towards complexity and even vulnerability can be one of the ways science fiction fantasy writers can break away from toxic tropes that promote toxic masculinity and the dehumanization of women?
Absolutely. I think that it's disingenuous sometimes to completely erase bigotry of all forms from literature.
Okay.
And I also think it's deeply important. It's difficult because it requires the author to interrogate all of their own assumptions. When I first wrote River of Teeth, it looked very different from how it looks now. River of Teeth, the way that it's published, is one of those books where bigotry is just not part of it. It's like, no, we're not doing that here. But the first draft had, all of it. It had homophobia and fatphobia and misogyny and racism and just all of it. Mm-hmm. And an early reader was like, this is kind of boring. Like, why do you need this? You can have more interesting motivations for your characters. And I rewrote it, and sure enough, it was way more interesting. It was way more vibrant. And it also just made a better story. I think that part of why it's so important to do things like that is because it's so easy for people who are looking for a misogynist to identify with to latch on to that character and say, actually, they're good. An example of this is right now, my household and I are rewatching the show Breaking Bad. Mm-hmm. We all watched it, a zillion years ago. And for some reason, we decided we wanted to rewatch it. We've been rewatching it. And I will tell you unequivocally, Walter White, the main character in Breaking Bad, who is a suburban dad who gets a form of lung cancer that he thinks is going to be terminal. He has very bad health care because it's the United States and we're a nightmare country. And so he decides to start cooking crystal meth to sell to save up money that he can give his family. And things go not according to his plan, and the whole thing, it's the origin story of a monster is the best way the show is described. He turns into a monster. And there are so many people who are like, oh no, actually he's the good guy, and his wife is horrible for not understanding him, and everyone who gets in his way is bad because they don't get what he's trying to do. But watching that show, especially through the critical lens of an author, it's so apparent to me that he's the worst person who's ever lived. He says that he's doing all this stuff for his family, but throughout the show, one of the big conflicts that keeps coming up is that the obstacles that he says he has to be terrible to overcome get taken away. And then he's like, no, I have to find some other reason to be terrible. His spoiler alert for anyone who doesn't know what happens in Breaking Bad, a show which came out a very long time ago, but Godspeed to us all. So spoiler alert, I'm going to talk about things that happen in later seasons. His lung cancer goes into remission, and he has a very successful surgery to take part of it out. And his son, who is, admires him a great deal, sets up a fundraiser to try and raise money so that the health costs don't bankrupt them, and his wife gets a job. He's got all these options and all this community waiting to help him and support him, but because he has this interior fantasy of being the cool villain in his own life who is doing bad things for the right reasons, and so it's okay to do them. And he actually explicitly says this in a later episode. He's like, I did terrible things, but I did them for the right reason. He's so desperate to acquire that he tramples on everyone he loves, and he's horribly destructive and cruel and violent and awful. And there are so many people who are fans of that show who idolize him because he represents that archetype of a horrible man who they think they're supposed to like and root for, instead of being able to see the complexity in his story. And I think that perspective on that character and on that show arises from the just density of characters like that who we're supposed to admire, who we are told by the narrative, by the score, by the direction, that they're the good guy who we're supposed to root for and be on his side. This is all a very roundabout way of saying I think that it's vital that we write stories that just do away with that say, yeah, this character could be a misogynist in this scene, but what would happen if we didn't have that option? This character could this is a common one that I have a lot of conversations about with people whose work I'm critiquing. There could be a scene with sexual violence here, but what if that was the least interesting option you could take? What would you do if you couldn't do that? What would that open up in the story? And frankly, that's a reflection of our world. What would happen in people's lives and in our culture and society if we just took those things away? They're needless boundaries and limitations. We can say, oh, I want to have misogyny in every workplace, and that'll keep women from accomplishing things. Great, okay, you did it. What if you didn't? What if you didn't do that boring thing, and instead you let things bloom and be complicated and interesting in the world? I think it would be better.
Do you think people are ready for that? Do you think writers and filmmakers and people are ready for those kind of stories? Or do you think that this alpha male the stereotype will stick around? So do you think also that it's a necessary stereotype? Like, we need this person just to show that this is how you should not be.
I don't think we need that at all. I think that the world is absolutely ready for that kind of thing, which I think is pretty demonstrable based on my work and the work of so many other SFF writers today who are writing exactly this kind of thing, who are writing worlds where bigotry isn't part of the conversation, it's not necessary, and people respond to it so strongly. I mean, even in works like Star Trek, which is highly flawed in a lot of ways and doesn't always interrogate its own internalized stereotypes well, the concept behind that was, what about a universe where we're past all that stuff? And that's part of why Star Trek was a huge success. And this was back in what, the 60s?
60s, yeah.
I want to say the 60s. The original Star Trek started out. It's the world's been ready for it. I think that the people who aren't ready for it are a very small percentage of culture and society who have convinced us that they're a very large percentage of culture and society. I think that they're the people who aren't ready for that are the people who benefit from its perpetuation, which is to say the people who are already in positions of institutional, structural, social power and authority. Who benefits from the repeated reinforcement that the role of a man in the world is to keep a woman down. The men benefit from that. We internalize from narrative and from media the way that the world is actually supposed to be. And so seeing that repeated narrative over and over again tells us, well, this is inevitable. This is just how things go. We also narrativize our own lives, right? This is a thing that people do all the time. We say, okay, what's the story that I'm in? What's the story I'm telling myself about the world? What's the story I'm telling myself about myself? And there's an existing story structure that we know about, that we can slot our lives into, we go to it. This is part of why so many people talk about their relationships in fairy tale terms, right? I met my Prince Charming. He was a knight in shining armor. He, was on a white horse. It was a Cinderella story. We do that because it's an easy way for us to comprehend and digest our lives and the events in them and the emotions that we feel. When all of those stories include misogyny and homophobia and racism and sexism and fatphobia and all of it, we end up applying that to our stories and just assuming that that's the role that we fit in.
Yeah, got it. So we have some comments from the audience. So Misty, first she says, thank you for answering my question. This was the question about the book recommendations, very informative. And then what we were talking about, after 2020, I believe we are ready for any new narratives in books and in visual media.
Seriously, no kidding.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, let's move on. More questions. Okay, so we were talking about stories, right? So stories are one of the most powerful ways of bringing about social change. Let's talk about writing and genre. In your opinion, how can authors strike a balance in their storytelling between raising awareness about violence against women while telling an engaging story without being pedantic or preachy?
Oh, that's a really great question. I think it can be difficult, especially as someone who's experienced a lot of gendered violence in their life. It can be hard for me sometimes to read stories about violence against women and people of marginalized genders without feeling like someone's trying to tell me about my own experiences. I'm always like, yeah, I know, and then I'm like, wait, this wasn't written specifically for me. What am I doing? I think the best way to go about writing those stories without coming across as preachy is, again, to embrace the complexity. A lot of us have this idea of narratives of violence and abuse as being very straightforward and very easy to identify. Part of this is because we have this tendency as human creatures to want to know how to avoid bad situations, right? So we'll say, oh, an abusive relationship looks like you don't have dinner on the table and someone hits you about it. Because we want to assume that we know what to look for and we know how to avoid bad situations. Unfortunately, actual violence, especially in domestic and relational situations, is a lot more complicated than that. It involves a lot of emotion and a lot of thought and a lot of interaction and engagement and a lot of slow escalation. Violence is rarely as straightforward as we see it in, Hallmark Channel movies. And I think that that's the way to write these stories, is to come at it from a place of relationship and complexity and saying, okay, what actually makes a person stay in a situation where they're being harmed? What makes a person react in the way that they do to being hurt? Because we all react differently to being hurt, right? We don't all react by saying, ouch. Some of us react by saying, I didn't feel anything. Some of us react by saying, I'll hurt you back. Some of us react by saying, I guess this is what love looks like. So I'm happy it's happening. There's a huge, broad, deep, vast array of different ways to engage with harm and hurt, and especially gender violence. And I think that leaning into that and leaning into the way that that's complicated and nuanced and chewy is the way to keep your writing about violence and harm from coming across as like a morality tale, like a lesson on what to do or what not to do. Because really nobody can teach that lesson that easily. No one can teach that lesson so quickly and succinctly as to be able to just write it in a quick story, like, here's a story about how not to be abused, the end. If it was that easy, abuse would not exist anymore.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so the line between consent and coercion isn't always clear in fantasy books. Certainly in some subgenres of fantasy, violence against women, especially rape, is still used to catalyze a male character's development, or as a shorthand for for showing how brutal the world is. Do you think this is something? This is an issue that writers in the genre have started tackling more successfully in recent years?
Yes and no. Within the community of genre fiction writers, it's a huge conversation. That said, I think we're working on it. I think we're getting someplace. I hope it's someplace better. I think that part of that is that there has been some movement toward more publication of marginalized gendered authors. People who are most likely to be on the receiving end of sexual violence are getting more of an opportunity to write about, their life experiences. And I think that's a big deal, because again, when you are someone who benefits from the repeated media assertions that like sexual violence is simultaneously the worst thing that can happen to somebody and also can be a throwaway plot for a character. It's easy to reproduce that. It's easy to reproduce that concept and that notion. I also think we're struggling though. I mean, it's very difficult to talk about sexual violence in a way that's going to be, for lack of a better word, satisfying for the reader. It's going to be effective. It's difficult to talk about sexual violence in a way that acknowledges how unacceptable it is without in some way fetishizing or valorizing it. As someone who's experienced a great deal of sexual violence and trauma, I'll say that something that frustrates me is narratives that insist that sexual violence is the biggest thing that can happen to a person, that it's this life-ending event, right? It takes some of the mundanity out of it and makes people struggle with the idea that it could happen all the time and they wouldn't recognize it or know about it, that they could even be perpetrating it without realizing it. Because, if it's this cataclysmic, awful thing to do to a person, wouldn't you know if you were inflicting that on them? And the reality is like, no. It's more nuanced, it's got more layers and more levels than that. At the same time, I'm never going to tell people, hey, write sexual violence like it's not a big deal, because that would be bananas. We don't want that in our fiction either. So I think that it's an ongoing struggle that's really tied into this connection between people trying to recognize the impact of violence, people trying to recognize victims of violence as human beings who don't deserve to be hurt, and people trying to recognize perpetrators of violence as potentially well-intentioned friends and family of theirs who might realize what they're doing and be doing it for reasons that they don't understand, who might not realize what they're doing at all, who might be doing what they're doing maliciously and intentionally and in order to cause harm. Like, I think that part of our struggle in talking about and writing about these issues is trying to understand them better in the real world and make sense of them, which is pretty hard and not something that I'm going to pretend to know how we can do.
Okay, because I was just about to ask you, do you have any suggestions for authors who want to include violence against women in their books?
I mean, my suggestions are pretty shallow, I think. One of my biggest suggestions is if you are someone who's never experienced gendered violence, maybe it's not something you have to write about. It's very difficult to get it right. And if you are going to include it, deeply interrogate the reasons why. Think really long and hard about what you're trying to do with that violence. Because if it's without a purpose, if it's just to move a plot forward, if it's just to motivate a character, if it's just to give someone a backstory, again, you can do more interesting stuff than that. Violence doesn't have to be the most interesting thing about someone. It doesn't have to be the most interesting thing that's happened in your life or in your character's life. An experience of violence, an experience of harm changes a person and shapes a person. But there's life after that too. If you survive violence, then you survived it. And you get to have a life past that. And I wish people would apply that to themselves and to their characters.
Yeah, that's a good place to start, really. Yeah. Okay, so culture and society tend to erase the role of women in history and overlook women's stories. Over the years, you've spoken in interviews and you've written about the power of women's voices, including a pretty powerful article for Tor.com that's called Fear of the Female Voice. Do you think that SFF authors are getting better at telling stories that center around women's perspective and experiences and ensuring that women's voices are heard?
I think that I have a question for this question, which is like, who are we counting as SFF authors? There have been female SFF writers. There have been Black SFF writers, trans SFF writers, non-binary SFF writers, Indigenous SFF writers. I could go on throughout history. And so when we talk about who counts as SFF writers, what are people writing? What are people saying? I think that really what we're engaging with is a question of whose voices are being published, paid for, and recognized. If we limit the conversation to that, then I think that SFF as a whole is definitely getting better because more marginalized voices are being compensated and recognized for the incredible stories that they have to tell and the value that they bring to the table. And that does definitely include female authors. If we're talking about, who's writing and what do they have to say and are they getting better at saying it, I would really hesitate to say yes to that because it kind of erases the work that marginalized SFF writers have been doing for decades. I mean, arguably the first science fiction book ever written was Frankenstein, which was written by a woman, and has so much to say about the world and about personhood and identity, and it could very easily be argued about womanhood. So I don't know, it's a thorny question because I don't ever want to engage with an idea that people haven't been writing SFF about women, nuanced, beautiful, engaging SFF about women this whole time. I think it's more a matter of who's been getting the money, who's been getting the awards, who's been getting the big book deals. And I think that publishers are doing a better job of recognizing that they need to pay more attention to a broader scope of voices and stories.
Yeah, I think you're right. Okay, so what do you think, speaking of stories, right? What do you think are the advantages that alternative histories and futures have as a way of highlighting extraordinary women that our real histories have erased?
Oh man, I think there's so much potential there. I mean, I love alternate history for a lot of reasons. Real histories, you're right, often do erase the contributions of anyone who isn't like a landed, wealthy white man. And also real histories tend to erase the deeds of those landed, wealthy white men, which tends to be not super palatable. I think that alternate history gives a real opportunity to do what we were talking about before and kind of erase the limits that that society history has historically has placed on marginalized people, giving an opening to say, okay, what if people with disabilities got to participate fully in society at every level throughout all of history? What would that be like? I mean, it's a fun playground as a person who is disabled. It's a fun playground to be in, to be like, what if somebody like me really could have done all of these things that were denied to people like me in the past? And giving that opportunity to women and to people of all marginalized genders and races and sexualities, I mean, it's super fun. And it's a great opportunity in alternate history also to draw attention to reality. A lot of people ask me about in River of Teeth, you've got people of color and queer people, and how did you come up with that imaginative idea, even though it takes place in the late 1800s? And I'm like, well, because it was real, because it actually happened. Like, most cowboys were black and brown. There were lots of queer people all over history. It's a great opportunity to say, these people were here. They were treated in different ways than they're treated in the works that we're writing, but like, they were here, they existed. Pay attention.
Yeah, good point. Okay. So speaking of including people, so geek culture in general, including science fiction and fantasy, has had its share of critics saying that it's still too male-dominated, despite there being a rising number of prominent, well-respected, and well-known female, non-binary, genderqueer authors. There's still also plenty of hostile, misogynist, and sexist behavior by male geeks towards female geeks and others. What do you think needs to be done to make geek culture as a whole, whether it's comics or gaming or books or even cons, more welcoming for women and girls?
This is such an interesting question in the wake of Worldcon, which happened this summer, and which really highlighted that there's kind of like a split in community in these worlds. There's the old guard and the new guard, as a lot of people talk about it, which again kind of erases the existence of marginalized people throughout the history of science fiction and fantasy, but is a kind of an easy way to split things, where you say, okay, here are the people who want to protect that more cis hetero patriarchal white supremacist founded culture, science fiction, fantasy. And then here are these queer, non-binary people of color, trans people, indigenous people who are being published more now. And there's some headbutting that happens in the middle there where the priorities are different. The things that people want to protect and illuminate and discuss are different and can feel oppositional. I hesitate to say my answer because, you know, I'm like part of the angry new class that's coming in and saying, you don't actually get to make the jokes that make people like me feel bad. You don't actually get to make fun of people's names that you don't know how to pronounce. Like that's weird
right.
and upsetting and gross and has no place in a community that should be welcoming to all people. I mean, I think that the way to fix it is to say, all right, if you're going to act like that, you don't get to talk anymore. But ultimately, that is the question of community, right? How do you change community? It's a very Ship of Theseus question. If you've got a boat and you change the sails and you change all the planks and you change all the oars and you change the figurehead, at what point does it become a whole new boat? If you've got a community and you tell all of the old white men who insist on being cruel and only upholding their own accomplishments is important, and you say, okay, you don't get to be the one who sets the tone for this community anymore, then is it the same community, or have you formed a new community?
But I mean,
again, another question I am not qualified to fully answer.
Okay, I see where you're coming from, but a community could evolve, right? Or shouldn't it evolve over time is to include what is happening right now in the world and all the people that are in it?
Absolutely. I think that in many ways that's the function of a community. The purpose of community, and again, this is like very socialist of me, but the purpose of a community is to serve and care for the people within it.
Yeah.
The problem you run into is when people say, oh, okay, then the only people that I want in my community are the people who look like me, or who love like me, or who worship like me, or whatever.
Okay,
then they say, great, this community exists to take care of me. That means that it excludes you. I think that in order for a community to thrive, it needs to be diverse and inclusive, and that means that it needs to invite the needs of all of the people who could potentially be a part of it and care for them as best it can. But that seems to be a controversial statement these days.
Well, I have another question which might be controversial. What would you say to readers who loudly protest lists of recommended female or trans authors, or non-binary genderqueer authors by saying stuff along the lines of, why should I care if the author is female or genderqueer? I don't see gender. Or, oh, this is PC gone nuts. What would you say to that?
I mean, we said that we wanted to keep this family friendly in terms of language, so I won't say what I would actually say to that. My thoughtful answer to that kind of statement is that anyone who claims not to see gender is really just saying that they don't see people. Gender is a part of the human experience. Even if you personally don't identify with any gender, gender is still part of your world and experience and perspective, because the how do I put this? The not identifying with any gender is still in and of itself a gender identity on the weird big plasma cloud that is gender. So people who say, I don't see gender, are really saying, I don't see how gender impacts people. And that means that they're saying there's a neutral. There's like a neutral gender that you can have that doesn't affect you and doesn't affect how you write and how you think. And that just doesn't exist. I mean, even if you are what people tend to think of as the default gender, which is a cis man, gender deeply impacts who you are and how you move through the world and how you treat people. So I would say to anybody who says, I don't need this because I don't see gender, that really what they're saying is that they're trying to blank out a huge part of the human experience and pretend that it doesn't matter. And that is very wishful thinking.
Mm-hmm.
That is a beautiful ambition. It is really beautiful to say, I wish that we lived in a world where gender didn't matter or have an effect on anyone. But I would say that you can be more ambitious than that and say, I wish that we lived in a world that equally supported and cared for people who are impacted by gender in all kinds of different ways. Instead of trying to erase it and deny it and say, this doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
You have the option of saying, this does exist, and we can recognize it and care for it and love it. And that's just so much better. It's just a better way to live your life and see the world. And it is so much less difficult, because denying that gender or sexuality or race or whatever, denying that that has an impact is so much effort. It's so difficult. It takes so much intentional ignorance of the people around you and what they're going through and how they feel and how they think. And I just find it so much simpler to say, oh yeah, okay, people exist and they're different.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Okay, so now we've been talking for more than an hour, believe it or not. And I've come to my final two questions. Well, it's sort of one question in two parts.
Okay.
So you have been very incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work as a whole. So this is a bit of an obvious question. Why do you support the cause to end violence against women?
You know what you said, this is kind of an obvious question, and I was like, I can come up with an answer to any question. And then you said that, and I was like, because it's bad. I support the cause to end violence against women because I have seen its impact on the world. I have seen its impact on people who I know and love, who don't even recognize how much it's harming them.
Mm-hmm.
Violence against women exists to keep women from being full versions of themselves, from living life as fully as they can, and from embracing the world that they could live in. I want to see people thrive, and violence against women destroys that thriving. So I support any cause that aims to end that violence.
Yeah, good. And you're right, it takes away the person's ability to thrive, and it's not just individuals, but there are many studies which by WHO and the UN which show that violence against women is an economic issue as well, because basically half the population is not contributing to the economy. Children are affected, so it's not just a moral issue. It's not just an ethical thing. It's basically everyone's livelihoods and everyone's quality of life is affected. Okay, so part two of the question is, what do you think authors can do, authors such as yourself who are read all over the world, what can you do to help with the cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women and girls?
I think that authors have a unique opportunity to show people new kinds of stories. A lot of us have got one kind of story in our head about the world and how it can work, and authors have the ability to tell a different kind of story and to say, actually, things can go a different way than you expect. And that change in expectations can include the removal of violence against women and people of marginalized genders in a narrative that installs a new neural pathway into one's brain that says to them, this could go differently. And I think that's a huge gift that authors can give the world.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so that was our last question. I just want to thank you, Sarah, for answering all our questions so brilliantly. We had a really good discussion, and I just want to thank people in the audience who are listening and who asked questions as well. There's an interesting discussion going on in the chat box as well. So I'm just going to put myself back on screen. Hi.
Hi again.
Okay, so now before we wrap up, I'm going to tell everybody again about all the awesome goodies that Sarah has given us that we've put up on our Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. So I mentioned before, there are two bundles, and the first one was the Sarah Gailey First Edition Book Bundle for Beginners, which has been already snapped up. by someone, a very generous donor, Stephanie Curry. So thank you so much, Stephanie. There is still one more left. So goodie number 2 is the Sarah Gailey Critiques Your Work in Progress goodie. And this is available worldwide. Sarah is offering a chance for one donor to get a written critique via email. This opportunity includes one written critique of your 10,000 word work in progress and a maximum of 5 emails sent to Sarah with your questions, also a maximum of 5 questions after they have sent you their critique. So there are also plenty more goodies up on the page. You can find things from Kat Cho, Kelly Garrett, Matt Gardner, RJ Barker, Tamara Pierce, Alwyn Hamilton, Marshall Ryan Makeza, Mary Lewis, so many more. We've raised $1,090 so far towards our $5,000 goal, a bit of a ways to go yet. So the fundraiser ends on 18th October. So please do give generously. All funds go towards our work to help end violence against women. Okay, I'm going to share a little slide here with, there you go, hope you can see it. Okay, I don't know why I'm doing that. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, so sorry about that. Something wrong with my screen. But meanwhile, our chat box moderators are going to be sharing the links to our Rally Up page. It's R4P Rally Up 2020. Just click on the link from there. And you can find all the goodies, including Sarah's. If you want to learn more about Read for Pixels or the other authors we have coming up, there's also a link that's going to be shared about the schedule. So go and check that out. And to find out more about violence against women and what you can do about it, visit the Pixel Project's website at thepixelproject.net, www.thepixelproject.net. Okay, so last thing to do is ask Sarah, do you have any announcements to make?
The only thing that I really have to promote right now is The Echo Wife, which is my upcoming novel coming out in February of 2021 from Tor Books. It is the story of Evelyn Caldwell, a brilliant scientist who invents adult duplicative cloning and who is divorcing her husband after discovering that he is having an affair with a clone he made of her by stealing her technology so that he could marry a less threatening version of her. Very relevant to our conversation tonight. Yeah. And I hope that viewers will check it out. You can get it anywhere books are sold, especially bookshop.org, which supports independent booksellers.
Awesome. Okay. I wonder if we have time for one very quick question, Sarah.
Sure.
I just always wanted to ask you this. It's been burning in my mind. Do you know if Tom Holland has ever done a televised lip sync to Umbrella by Rihanna?
As a matter of fact, I believe he has. I believe that Tom Holland, of Spider-Man fame, has indeed done a televised lip sync of the song Umbrella by Rihanna. And I think it would benefit your viewers to check it out.
I'll check that too. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so Sarah and I will say goodbye to everyone. Good evening, good morning, good night, wherever you are in the world, and goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody.